So the next question is this. The Torah, there's no doubt, has seriously impacted the world's value system, at least in Western culture, but you could say, values such as the dignity of human life, the importance of the family, ethical monotheism, these values are really key pillars to so many people's lives. The majority of the world probably believes in the God of Abraham. But the question that I want to ask on this is actually, can the world's values actually ever impact our own Jewish values and Jewish legal system? And how can Jewish law adapt to societal change?
This is a very good question, a very interesting one. I think it can be answered on two levels. It can be answered on a more pragmatic level, and then it can be answered on a deeper, more profound philosophical level. On a pragmatic level, halacha is always based on the circumstances, and therefore, as society changes, halacha will reflect that societal change in how it assesses and deals with a situation. So this can be as simple and as trivial as the laws of bracha, making a blessing, expressing appreciation on eating food, in which as dietary habits change, the way halacha expresses itself in the way the bracha that's appropriate to make, the blessing that's appropriate to make on a particular food can alter. So it can be something very, very trivial, or as significant as the role of women within society. So for example, there's a Gemara that speaks about on Pesach, on Seder night, we lean in order to express our sense of freedom and our sense of dignity in leaving the slavery of Egypt and expressing our sense of being free people. And the Gemara says that a woman doesn't lean on Seder night because Eimat ba'aleh, the awe or fear of her husband is on her. This is what the Gemara says. And the poskim already from the medieval era and onwards, or the Gemara already actually going back to the time of the Gemara says that if she is an isha chashuva, if she is an important woman, then she can lean because she won't have eimat ba'aleh, she won't be someone who is in awe or perhaps afraid of her husband.
Yeah, now it's the other way around, it's the husband has the fear of the wife.
And the poskim already say that nowadays, the poskim already from the medieval era, the halachic authorities already from the medieval era, comment that nowadays all women can lean at the Seder.
Yeah.
And the reason they say this is because Noshim Didon, our women are chashuvas, they're all important and they're all in a situation in which they're entitled to lean. So
are these values changing? Or
so Moshe Feinstein, who was perhaps the most prominent halachic authority of the latter half of the 20th century in America, he comments that what's happening over here is the Gemara isn't expressing a value. The Gemara isn't saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, that's eimat ba'aleh. The Gemara is simply reflecting society at the time, and it's simply saying this is the mitzvah, this is the fact, this is the way the circumstances are, and therefore she wouldn't be comfortable to lean. It wouldn't be an appropriate expression of freedom for her to lean. Mm-hmm. Society shifts, and it had already shifted by the medieval era, and now she would feel comfortable to lean, and therefore halacha will change to reflect that. So this can be on a very trivial and basic level, as we said in the laws of blessings or the laws of the leaning on Seder night. But where you get to a more profound discussion is the whole area of enhanced sensitivity towards morals and values which perhaps Western society or modern society has, and perhaps which didn't exist in the past. And here you get to somewhat of a controversy in Jewish thinking, and perhaps a divide between perhaps the way the Kabbalists might look at things and how Rambam, Maimonides, might look at things. And the Rambam certainly in his Guide to the Perplexed, in his Mo'er Nevuchim, seems to have been acutely aware, and discusses the idea of moral and sensitivities, moral sensibilities, ethical sensibilities, and the idea that perhaps we can have a change and a generational shift in which perhaps we become more aware of such things as time moves on, and perhaps sometimes ironically as the values of the Torah themselves become more integrated into society, we're allowed and able to have enhanced moral sensibilities that perhaps we wouldn't have had in the past, something that Rabbi Sachs also speaks about in various of his works. So for example, if we look at the issue of slavery in the Torah, and we reflect on how we apply that nowadays. So you have two broad approaches to how you might address this. And the problem is, of course, that the Torah does allow slavery to exist. It's something that the Torah recognizes and gives legal acknowledgement to. And has a very...
In similar forms to the way it was practiced, say, in America?
In a very different form, and that's the point. The Torah accepts the phenomena of slavery, acknowledges it, and then builds a very, very tight system of protection around it. Mm-hmm. So it builds a set of values in which a master certainly wouldn't be allowed to inflict physical pain on a slave, which a master certainly would need to respect the life of the slave. In fact, the killing of a slave would be treated as murder in halacha, in the Torah system. This wouldn't be something that would be trivialized. So the Torah takes the idea of slavery, something that we're not necessarily comfortable with at all. It accepts it, and yet it builds a very tight system of protection around it, a very, very specific and tight system of protection. Nonetheless, it does acknowledge and allow its existence. And here we need to ask ourselves, how do we live with that in the 21st century when this is certainly a value that's unacceptable? So here there's two ways of looking at the system. You could say the Torah is reflecting intrinsic existential values that therefore need to exist for all time. And if we in the Western world aren't comfortable with the idea, we've clearly got something wrong. Perhaps there are people for whom, as a temporary step, reflecting the economic circumstances or their education or their environment, this is the best they can achieve at this difficult stage in their lives, and therefore this is an appropriate way for society to function. Or we can say perhaps the Torah is a reluctant accommodation to the reality as it existed then.
And as reality changes.
And therefore, as society changes, it's something that we can certainly move on in sensitivity. So if we move back to the economy as it existed 3,500 years ago, it may be in that economic climate it wasn't feasible to dismiss slavery as a phenomenon of society completely. It was just something that was necessary. Perhaps even there was something positive in Jews being allowed to engage in slavery. If the whole of society and the whole of the world had slaves, then perhaps it was a good thing for Jews to be able to buy slaves and give them an enhanced protection in their life that they wouldn't have had Jews not been able to engage in slavery. But this certainly, in this way of thinking, wouldn't be an ideal. This would be a reluctant accommodation to the values at the time, to the values as they existed. But if we are now able to live in a society in which we economically don't need slavery, and indeed we have the sensitivity to realize what a travesty this is of the value of human life, then maybe indeed this would be something that wouldn't be appropriate for us to have. And this is certainly the approach that the Rambam and those that follow that system of thought would take.
So what you're saying is that the values of the world can change by and large through Torah concepts having greater influence in the world. And as society's, methods of doing things changes, then Jewish law can change the way it accommodates certain realities and certain...
That's correct. In other words, if you build a society in which there's constant emphasis on the value of human life, so we speak again and again about, remember, you were slaves in Egypt. And therefore this is meant to change the nature of what sort of person you are, how you view yourself. If we think about the founding story we tell about ourselves as Jews, we talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus out of Egypt. If we talk about what a Jew is an ex-slave. That's what it means to be a Jew. A Jew is a freed slave. We're not nice, middle-class, suburban person living in the leafy environs of Golders Green and Hansen.
Right.
We're Jews, we're ex-slaves. Ex-slaves, what sort of people are we? That means we're people who are poorly educated. Slaves don't necessarily have the best standards of hygiene. Slavery can affect the morality of the slave. We can become self-centered and selfish. And we're meant to remember that's what we are. What does it mean to be a Jew? To be a Jew means to be an ex-slave. So if you inculcate a society with these values, and the Torah says again and again, perhaps 30, 40 times in the Torah, remember that you were slaves who left Egypt, and therefore look after the weak and the vulnerable in society. Look after the orphans and the widows and those who are needy. Look after the stranger that lives in your gate. If we have these values deep-rooted within our souls, if we build a system for protection, even in the area of slavery for the slaves that we're dealing with, at some point or other in society we're going to shift our mind view, something's going to go click. At some point in our lives we're going to realize that these are other human beings that we're dealing with. We're dealing with humans, and at that point we're going to express a revulsion of the whole concept of slavery. And therefore this is going to introduce, the Torah is introducing in this way of thinking, a gradual process, a slow process, which will lead eventually to a society that's able to rid itself of slavery. So society over time will shift towards a sensitivity and awareness of these values, which will lead to a society that's eventually able to cope without slavery at all.
Right.
This idea is expressed already in the Gemara, so this isn't an innovative idea. The Rambam and others would find sources from this, from the Talmud itself, from the Gemara itself. The sages of the Talmud itself comment on various mitzvahs, which they themselves question the ethics and morality of this particular halakha. And they said, Lo dibra Torah elo keneged yetzer hara. The Torah here was reluctantly accommodating the negative aspect of society, the negative aspect of human beings, and it was trying to accommodate and shift and create a transition in values in the area. Lo dibra Torah elo keneged yetzer hara. The Torah was saying, this is how the human psyche is, this is where society is up to at the moment, and therefore we're going to
But that doesn't necessarily mean progress. That doesn't necessarily mean that the sages of the Talmud are saying the Torah wants us to progress away from this point to the stage where we don't have that negative urge. It could just be saying we will always have this negative urge, and therefore
it's true. You don't see in that a source for progress, but you do see in that a source for the idea that the Torah sometimes will reluctantly accommodate features of the human makeup and the human psyche, rather than being as idealistic as we would perhaps like it to be, in which it would only have things of the highest ethical and moral standards. In other words, the Torah is a pragmatic document also. It's a pragmatic legal system. It's a legal system that recognizes human foibles and human nature and human weaknesses and will sometimes accommodate them. Which means to say it's not against the thinking of the Talmud to suggest that there could be situations in which we can move on. The halachic system recognizes the idea of chumrah, the idea of stringency, or going beyond the letter of the law. It recognizes the idea of hidur, of us as human beings creating a beautification of the halachic and legal system. And therefore I would suggest that we could view this as an area in which we are able, as a society now, to be machmir, to go beyond the basic rock-bottom level that halacha sets, and therefore we're able to exist and move beyond the idea of slavery, having taken and integrated within ourselves the values that the Torah wishes to put forward.
Right. Now, if we go according to that paradigm, then there seems to me to be a very obvious danger, which is that we could be in any society and we could say that, oh, society does this, or they have this value, and you could make the argument that it's rooted in Torah principles and it's been influenced by Torah values, and actually it hasn't. And people, for whatever reason, whether it's with a insincere or sincere motivation, will say, let's take on that value, or we should adapt our laws to incorporate that value. And you could end up creating a Jewish legal system which actually doesn't reflect Jewish values, which is seemingly very, very, very dangerous. How can you know what is and isn't derived from Jewish values?
So this is also a very important and interesting question. I think there's a few points to be said on this. The first point is we're not over here talking about using values to allow that which the Torah prohibits. There's no particular mitzvah in the Torah which says thou shalt owe slaves. There's simply a set of halachas that if you do owe a slave, this is a way to behave. So the halachic system still has very, very clearly delineated lines in the sand, limits, parameters, which shifting values aren't going to allow to shift. So I think this is the first point to make. In a way, actually, here we're talking about being more stringent than the halachic system demands. We're saying the halachic system allows slavery within certain parameters, and we're saying we no longer feel comfortable, we no longer feel that this is spiritually appropriate or ethically or morally appropriate for us to do. So I think this is the first point to be made. The second point to be made is that when societal values shift, and perhaps feminism is a good example of this, it takes the halachic system a fair amount of time to adapt to that and to address it and to deal with it. And this can sometimes be a source of frustration, considerable frustration, because when I say a fair amount of time, it can mean decades or generations. And during this time, the halachists are trying to thrash out the issue, they're trying to address the issue, they're trying to deal with it, and they're trying to see how halacha can and cannot respond to it. This can again be on something very technical, very pragmatic. When electricity first became a common phenomenon, something that was around in society, it took halachas perhaps 100 years of conversation to address it, to deal with it. How exactly do we deal with electricity on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, in areas of other mitzvot, in areas in which we as human beings need to produce things, matzot and other such matters. So it takes the halachic system a long time to address machinery, to address electricity, to address modern phenomena. Sometimes things are dealt with more swiftly when there's a particularly pressing need. For example, some of the innovations in genetic medical care, in fertility treatments, halacha will deal with it fairly quickly. But what will happen is, as in any other area of human achievement, any other area of human wisdom, the experts will debate, and there'll be controversy, and there'll be discussion, and opinions will be put forward, and they'll go to peer review in which other scholars in the generation discuss these ideas. And it can take the halachic system time to deal with it. There's other reasons why it can take the halachic system time to deal with it, because halacha is fundamentally a conversation across the generations, and halacha therefore needs to take time till it's able to address a particular topic. There can't be a sense of rupture within tradition. Things can take time for Judaism, and Judaism, don't forget, isn't just a legal system, it's a societal system, it's a cultural system, it's a way of being, it's a way of living, and it can take time for any society to adjust to these new circumstances. Now, the fact that halacha can take time to adjust is a challenge sometimes, because it can leave people frustrated in the meantime, but it's also a great strength, because it gives us time to pause, to reflect, to think about the implications, to consider, is this just a passing phase in human morality? Is this just a passing phase of modernity and something that's in fashion today and going to be out of fashion tomorrow? Or does this indeed reflect a deeper, more integral value? And I think this is part of the reason why as a society, and why halacha itself has a system, a very rigorous process of dealing with these issues. It's not just willy-nilly a new value comes online and therefore we're able to change it and change how we deal with it. It's something that has to be worked through a very, very rigorous process, a process in which experts look and consider the sources. And here I'm picking my examples very carefully. There aren't easy examples necessarily to come up with in which we can see where society, where halachists over time have accepted a change in societal values and the halachic system has integrated it. But this is a process.
How long would it take for a change in the halachic system to occur?
As I said, I think it depends on the nature of the halacha and how difficult the topic is. Difficult topics can take longer. They can be difficult because of the halachic nature of the topic, and be difficult because of the societal change and shift in this. But halacha, we do see adapts to changed values and different circumstances. I think also one needs to look at the nature of the values that we're expressing and see if at core they reflect Jewish values and halachic values themselves.
Very difficult to do.
Very difficult to do. But for example, if we look at the area of slavery, we see the impetus and the core value behind our sensitivity towards us and our discomfort with the idea of slavery is something rooted in Torah values, the respect for all human lives, the respect for the dignity of a human being. The Torah itself, the Talmud itself tells us, why is it that we speak about Lomon Nivra Ha'adam Yechidi? Why do we talk about man, the first human being, being created alone? Why don't we ascribe human existence to a multiplicity of ancestry? Why is it that the Torah teaches us that God created one human being from whom all human beings come? And the Talmud gives several answers. The Mishnah gives several answers to this question. One answer is a very interesting answer. It says that it teaches us that anyone who saves a single human life is like someone who saves a whole world, because the whole vast world that we see in front of us stems from one human being. But another answer the Talmud gives is so that no one person can turn to someone else and say, my ancestor was greater than your ancestor, because all of us descend from one human being. So we see that at heart, these are values which stem from the Torah itself. These are values which are acknowledged by the Torah, values that are acknowledged by the halachic system, and therefore perhaps these are ones which the halachic system is able to integrate into itself.
I feel like people are able to construe arguments to justify almost any societal value and say that the Torah should adjust to it. For example, in the role of, you talk about feminism. Now, the question of differences of gender in Jewish law is obviously a very big topic. There's many different opinions on the matter. How would you be able to decipher what is something that Jewish law can endorse or adapt to and not? Because I feel like you could, you could almost justify anything. So how do we decide it? Is it based on consensus? Because it doesn't always seem to be the case. There seem to be some people that differ, and they're okay with differing within the halachic system.
So a very interesting question and an important one. I'd like to make 2 points about it. The first point is that just because something is dangerous, or just because something can be misunderstood, or just because something is difficult to apply doesn't make it untrue. And it's certainly true that the model we're talking about within halacha is dangerous and sensitive and difficult to apply, but it doesn't make it untrue. And actually I would argue, just going back to the idea I was expressing, that perhaps one of the privileges of being a Jew and the privileges of trying to live a halachic life is that we are engaged in constant conversation between the modern world and the classic world of halacha. And if you think about it, if you want to live as a reflective human being, it's so important to have that conversation going on. Because otherwise we just drift through life, living within the society within which we live, and never perhaps having the chance to question and step out of it and look at some of its values and ask ourselves. And if you ask me, when I work as a teacher, I work in a school, when I ask myself, what are the gifts that I'm trying through teaching Jewish studies to students, trying to offer as teenagers, what I most want to give them, part of what I most want to give them, and part of the great privilege of being a Jewish teenager, is that you're trying to balance these two cultures, these two worlds. You're living within the modern world, and yet you're forced to question the values of the modern world. You're forced sometimes to step out of it and reflect on these values. What am I taking for granted? What are actually values that I believe, and what do I believe just because everyone else is doing it? To be a Jew is to be someone who's engaged in conversation across the generations. It's to be engaged in a classic tradition. It's to be engaged in conversation with the great prophets that lived 3,500 years ago. It's to be engaged in conversation, to enter the Beit HaMedrash of the great Talmudic figures, Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Shmuel, Abai and Rava. The Talmud is written as a conversation. It's written as a debate between rabbis and between students and between scholars that takes place in the Beit HaMedrash, and similar debates still take place to this day. When you learn Talmud, you're entering a conversation, you're becoming part of a conversation. And to be part of a conversation is the greatest privilege in the world. So to be forced to question, to be forced to balance, to look at a tradition, to be able to engage in conversation with the great classic thinkers of the Jewish past, of the halachic past, and to use that as a means to bounce off modern values and current values against the classic tradition, to me that's the greatest privilege that's possible to exist in the world. That's something phenomenal.
But how do you determine what is a legitimate opinion, and you say, oh, I agree with that, or I disagree with that, and a legitimate path for Jewish law, and something which is beyond the pale, which you say, no, you've incorporated societal values too far. That doesn't reflect Jewish values. How do you determine what is and what isn't?
It's hard to give a general answer to this question without getting into nitty-gritty, but let's take the example of feminism that you mentioned before, and let's just do a little bit of thinking about that. So the first question we'd ask ourselves is, does feminism reflect values which are at heart, values that we care about as Jews, values which are reflected within the Torah and expressions of Torah itself? And I think the answer to that is probably nuanced, probably a difficult question to answer. Certainly many of the values that are expressed in feminism absolutely do come from values that we would recognize within Torah and within halacha. Respect for human beings, respect for the dignity of every human being. Moshe Feinstein himself, I mentioned before, important classic halachic authority of the late 20th century, speaks in the context of this discussion we had about the changing role of women. He speaks about this sometimes not being a changing nature of women, but actually changing nature of men and being able to recognize the value and dignity of women, of all human beings. So the core value there, very much a Torah value. Some of the elements of feminism, some of the elements of that development within society perhaps come from values which aren't Torah values. It's very hard to justify in Torah, or even in actually philosophically speaking, the idea of a complete egalitarianism, the idea that when we often use phrases, we talk about all human beings being equal, but then we ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say that all human beings are equal? Do we mean that they all have equality of opportunity? Do we mean they're literally equal? Well, clearly not. No matter what we do in society, different human beings. Would we want to aim for a society in which all human beings have absolute equality of opportunity? Is that possible? Is it possible for all human beings to have an identical IQ, to have an identical charisma, to have an identical appearance, to have identical opportunities in life, without us making an extreme communist society where people have identical financial opportunities, identical family opportunities?
You want to do as much as you can.
So when we talk about equality as being an ideal, perhaps there's something about the makeup of the world which suggests that this just isn't how the world is, it isn't the way it is. If we talk about equality of outcome, well, here it depends how we define outcome, and this is the interesting point. If we define outcome as having equal wealth, equal life experiences, again, what sort of state would that make in society? We clearly need to balance equality with other values that we hold precious within society. We hold precious within society family, we hold precious within society liberal democracy, we hold precious within society the property rights and the idea that people can earn and therefore inevitably have differences in their financial and economic stability in life and their financial opportunities. So clearly there are differences even in equality of outcome. And then we need to ask ourselves what outcome is important to us as a society. So here, if we ask that in the context of Judaism, we will say self-development as a human being, ability to be a spiritual, emotionally, psychologically fulfilled person, ability to have a deep and meaningful relationship with God. And if we ask ourselves in that sense, is Judaism equal? Absolutely it's equal. The highest spiritual level a person can achieve, the idea of being a prophet, someone who's able to communicate directly, to hear God's voice in the universe, to hear God's voice in the world. What else could it mean than that? How else could a human being be higher than that? And that's something that's absolutely accessible to men and women. So we need in every situation to think through the value of equality as a value itself, and how do we define the outcome that we're looking at. And if we define the outcome as ability to operate financially, ability to operate in the public sphere, maybe we're not an egalitarian society. If we define the outcome by that which matters to us as Orthodox Jews, then yes, we do value equality.
My question is, who decides? Do you have to make your own judgment as to whether this is beyond the pale or not? Or is it based on consensus? How does it work within the legal framework of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable changes and movements in halakha?
So I think there's two elements to this answer. The first element is that, like any other sphere of human expertise, one does need to consult the experts. And again, perhaps in a society in which we value autonomy as very high up the scale values, quite near the top of the pyramid of things that matter to us, we're sometimes uncomfortable with the idea that halacha demands of us to consult a posek, to consult a halachic authority, to consult a rabbi. But the truth is, it's no different to any other area of expertise, and in exactly the same way as you would consult an expert doctor if there's a medical challenge, or a scientist if there's a scientific challenge. Yes, the halachic system says they're experts on halacha. It's a technical area as much as any other technical area of human wisdom and human insight, and therefore one would need to consult a technical expert. Certainly when one's dealing with cutting-edge halachic issues.
But you could find a rabbi that will tell you what you want to hear eventually,
In the same way I would suggest as you can find a doctor who would tell you that which you want to hear. You need to, in exactly the same way as you decide to choose a doctor, you need to choose a rabbi. You need to choose someone who's recognized and respected by his peers, someone who has passed certain qualifications that are needed, someone who is willing to engage in conversation, peer review, conversation with other scholars and other experts of his time, and see whether this is someone who's respected by their peers, someone who has genuinely that level of expertise and that level of insight. There isn't a formal system within any field necessarily of identifying, as long as someone has passed their basic professional qualifications. But in the same way as there can be outlying views in the medical profession, which people perhaps would have medical qualifications and still argue that certain consensus within medicine is wrong. And generally speaking, we will condemn these people to the realm of conspiracy theorists and rule out what they say. On rare occasion, they may indeed be groundbreaking thinkers who indeed have original insight, but generally speaking, we would assume that these are people who are lacking expertise if the consensus of their peers believe so. Similarly, in this area over here, one needs to consult experts who are qualified to pass judgment in their lives.
So if you were living in the time of Maimonides, the Rambam, who was, I believe he was ostracized at one point, excommunicated, would you say this guy's a quack at the time and not follow him?
There's several points about the Rambam. The Rambam did raise discomfort, and some of the ideas he expressed promoted a lot of controversy in his time.
But he's not the only
one. On the other hand, the Rambam was also an acknowledged expert in Torah, and no one ever denied that.
Right.
So the Rambam wrote works which were phenomenal by any measure. So his Mishnah Torah, his classic halachic work, his commentary on the Mishnayos. These were works that at a young age led to the Rambam becoming recognized as the outstanding or an outstanding scholar of his times, of his generation. He also wrote certain philosophical works which indeed raised controversy and created upset. But this is the point over here. The Rambam was clearly qualified and recognized even by his contemporaries, and certainly by time that followed, as someone who was qualified to say and pass judgment about halacha and about areas of Jewish insight. And yes, some of the ideas he said created a lot of upset and disquiet amongst the people at his time. But the Rambam certainly crossed the threshold of being a great thinker and great halachist, and universally recognized as such. So I think this is the first point that needs to be said in terms of how one goes about making a decision. The second point to be aware of is that the sages of the Talmud, Chazal, had an almost postmodern relationship to the truths of Torah, in which they understood that Torah being given to human beings means it's a two-way communication, a two-way conversation. And I'll tell you something interesting. When one engages in conversation, in speech, we think of the speaker as being the source of the speech that's being said, the communication that's being said, because of course the speaker is the person making the sound and saying it. However, in truth, the listener is an equal partner in that conversation. Because if someone is speaking but no one can understand them, no one can listen, no one can hear and understand and comprehend what they're saying, then this isn't speech, this isn't communication, it's simply sounds. And we believe, therefore, we are partners with Hashem in hearing the Torah, almost in creating the Torah that exists. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, speaking, needs us as the Jewish people to hear and to listen for this indeed to become words of Torah. And for that reason, the sages of the Talmud spoke about 70 faces to the Torah, Shivim Ponim la Torah. They spoke about Eilu ve'Eilu devilikim chaim, two different viewpoints, both being the words of the living God. And therefore, in us listening to those who are qualified, and I'll speak in a moment about qualified, those who are qualified to hear the word of God, through human beings hearing the word of God, we are ourselves creating the Torah, and we are understanding those words. But one has to be qualified to hear the word of God, and this is the other side of it. One has to be technically qualified. One has to be able to tap into the tradition, to work through what the tradition has to say. Just because there's 70 voices to the Torah, 70 perspectives, doesn't mean that there's a 71st or 70 seconds.
No, I guess
there has to be genuine...
I can't be the 71st then.
There has to be genuine hearing and understanding of what the Torah has to say. So as a minimum, the people who are voicing opinions have to be able to learn through the tradition. And very often, sadly, one hears people expressing opinions, people who can't necessarily work their way well through a page of Talmud or through a lengthy response of the Rashba. perhaps not so people who are able to tap into the tradition, therefore they don't have the right to express a voice or to hear an opinion of what the Torah has to say, certainly not on a halakhic or profound philosophical level, because they aren't people who are able to engage in that
And
conversation.
what happens when they are very learned and then they say things which are causing a lot of upset, or many people think are unacceptable?
Again, as I said, even people who are qualified can sometimes take a viewpoint which, by the consensus of their peers, isn't considered correct. And then, again, one would have to... Look, even the greatest halachic decisors, a great figure like Moshe Feinstein, a figure like the Rambam Maimonides, not everything they said became accepted by society. Not everything they said became accepted by their peers. We speak about Moshe Feinstein as being a great halachic figure because perhaps 70% of his tshuva, 70% of his sponsor became classic, became normative in halacha. But even then, in Judaism is ultimately democratic amongst those who are qualified to pass judgment. And even in areas in which a great halachic figure expresses a viewpoint, the consensus may arise not like them. There won't arise controversy over this viewpoint because this is someone who is widely considered competent to express an opinion. And even when their opinion doesn't become the consensus, not mistaken over a stupid or elementary point. Simply not a judgment call that's accepted. If you see a greater figure, even someone who is on paper qualified, who makes mistakes which are even on paper not justified, simply mistranslations, misreading of sources, then there will be controversy and upset with what they're saying.
Is it legitimate to follow a rabbi who the consensus, his peers don't agree with, but is a learned man? Is that a legitimate thing to do? You just say, well, he's my rabbi, he's just one opinion. The other people didn't agree with, he's in the minority, but I want to follow this rabbi.
If peers and the majority or almost all of the scholarly world disagree with someone, that ought to give one pause for thought. To question why is it that everyone is disagreeing with this person. And at the end of the day, human beings are human beings. People can be on paper qualified and yet lack good judgment. People can have all sorts of bias that can corrupt and twist and distort their ability to make reasoned decisions. And therefore, certainly someone who isn't an expert in the field, exactly in the same way as in medicine, would be wise to go to someone who's respected within their field. It's the same in halacha. It's wise to go to someone who is respected within their field. Now, this doesn't mean to say that everyone just has to follow the consensus and there isn't room for conversation. There have been great figures in history, you mentioned the Rambam and many others, Rav Kook, Rav Hirsch, etc., who took on minority opinions, but were still widely respected by their peers, even whilst they disagreed with them. So there's certainly...
They're seen as legitimate opinions.
They're seen as a legitimate opinion, albeit a minority one. And there's certainly room in Judaism for many, many voices, and there continues to be room in Judaism for many, many voices. And it's an interesting thing, because you can see two different figures, both of whom express ideas which don't go with the majority or don't go with the consensus, and superficially appear to be saying very similar things, and yet one will be accepted within the halachic system or within orthodoxy, and the other will be rejected. And the reason one will be accepted and the other will be rejected often comes down to simply technical issues of expertise. One of them is expressing a view that just isn't justified within the tradition. And it may be difficult for the layman person or the person who isn't qualified to see the difference. And the other one, people can radically disagree with them, and there can be vigorous debates with everything they're expressing, but people recognize that this person is entitled to express a view. Because they're simply qualified to express an opinion. These people are great experts in the field who have genuinely a genuine ability to engage in conversation with the tradition, with the sources, genuinely able to come up with profound insights of Torah and Torah truths, speak to the modern world and engage with it. And therefore their view is accepted as a minority opinion, but one which they're entitled to say, and this is an important point.
So just to end this question, which we've kind of really fleshed out,
just
going all the way back to the beginning now, you've said that it is possible that Jewish values can impact society can change, and then Jewish law can respond and adapt. You said there's also another train of thought which says that Jewish law and Jewish values remain the same. Can you just present that opinion, just so it's clear what that opinion is and how that works?
Let me just tweak, first of all, how you phrase your question, and then I'll try and address it. I think all approaches to Judaism, at least those of which I'm aware, would agree that halacha, of course, adapts to changing circumstances. Halacha is all about applying the core principles to the situation as it is in front of us, and therefore, of course, if in the modern world the situation has changed, how halacha deals with it will also differ. The more controversial element of this is whether there can be some change to the values that are brought to bear on the halachic system itself. Not just how halacha is applied, but the actual system itself, the values and the legal system itself. And here the Rambam, within very tight parameters, would think that these values can change. The tight parameters are both that they have to be true to the halachic system in terms of their application, and that the core values have to be at heart Torah values, values which are integral to how the Torah sees the world, albeit values which perhaps have shifted over the time in our ability to integrate them to society and to how we operate. This is perhaps, and I say this tentatively because I'm not an expert on the subject, perhaps in contrast to the more Kabbalistic approach, which sees the values of Torah as more existential, more intrinsic, and therefore perhaps harder for them to shift or perhaps unshiftable in terms of the essence of the spiritual truths that they express.